Chapter 21, July 1914, Deception, Manipulation, and Misrepresentation. The first weeks. The smoldering distrust and racially inflamed tensions that continually raised the political temperature in the Balkans after the uneasy peace of 1913 were very deliberately reignited by the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Civilized Europe was stunned by his murder. His uncle, the elderly Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph, went into shock. Acrid, acrid demands for retribution filled the air. It took careful planning and considered judgment on the part of the secret elite to fan the understandable outrage and bring about the great European conflagration for which they had planned since before 1905. Furthermore, it required the highest level of diplomatic skill and political nous allied to press connivance, unseen sleights of hand, and downright lies to achieve the ultimate goal of war with Germany. War apparently started by Germany, war that would once and for all crush Germany and reaffirm the preeminence of the British race. While the Archduke's murder has generally been accepted as the spark that lit the fuse, it did not make the subsequent war inevitable. Far from it. The act in itself presented no cause for a world war. Assassinations and political murders were not uncommon in these troubled parts, with royalty, prime ministers, political opponents, and religious leaders all victims in the recent past. This was different. The secret elite deliberately and systematically whipped the consequences on, on Sarajevo into a raging wildfire that could not be extinguished. From the hub of the Foreign Office in July of 1914, Sir Edward Grey and his ambassadorial guard abused their position in order to trick both Austria-Hungary and Germany into a European war. A diplomatic network of highly experienced ambassadors committed to the secret elite vision of the preeminence of the British race was in place throughout the European capitals. Sir George Buchanan in St. Petersburg, Sir Maurice de Bunsen in Vienna, Sir Edward Goschen in Berlin, and Sir Francis Bertie in Paris. Each was entrusted with the task of manipulating the Balkan crisis into a war that would see the Anglo-centric influence dominate the world. Highly confidential information and instruction passed to and fro between them and London, where Sir Erie Crowe and Sir Arthur Nicholson headed Grey's personal Praetorian Guard in the all-powerful Foreign Office. Even where the major players appeared to be Russian, Sazonov and Izvolsky, or French, Poincaré and Maurice Paleologue, the French ambassador at St. Petersburg in 1914, their actions were sanctioned from London. The last days of June and the first week of July were, on the surface, comparatively calm. An outpouring of sympathy for Austria and its monarchy followed the initial shock of the assassination. In a parliamentary address on the 30th of June, Prime Minister Asquith stated that Emperor Franz Joseph and his people have always been our friends. End quote. He spoke of abhorrence of the crime, and the profound sympathy of the British Parliament. In France, President Poincaré expressed his sincere condolences. Profound sincerity did not last long. Franz Ferdinand had not been particularly popular in some Austrian circles because of his morganatic marriage and the suspicion that he favored Austria-Hungary's Slavic subjects. In many ways, he was relatively enlightened about democratic rights and freedoms, a philosophy that was not shared by the Habsburg traditionalists. Despite the Archduke's high office and his position in rank as heir apparent, his funeral was decidedly low-key. The Austrian foreign minister, Count Leopold Berchtold, allegedly wanted it that way. Kaiser Wilhelm definitely intended to go. Franz Ferdinand had been a close personal friend, and it was his duty to show public respect to the aging emperor. The Kaiser, however, developed diplomatic lumbago, lumbago when it was put about that a dozen Serbian assassins were making their way to Vienna to kill him. Prince Arthur of Connaught was the designated representative for King George V, but quite suddenly, on the 2nd of July, he and all other members of European royalty cancelled. Everyone. Fears were expressed that other assassins were ready to do away with any passing royalty. No collection of funeral crowned heads gathered in Vienna. Count Berchtold did not want a rabble of royalty descending on Vienna. He hoped to spare the ailing emperor the vexation of a long funeral ceremony. Perhaps Berchtold feared that a gathering of emperors, kings, and princes in Vienna would have distracted the Habsburg government in its determination to seek retribution from Serbia. It most suddenly suited the secret elite that Berchtold was left unfettered by interference from visiting dignitaries who might have cautioned care. Izvolsky, the secret elite's Russian puppet master, knew immediately what the success of the mission in Sarajevo meant. On the following day, he left Paris in utmost secrecy and slipped out of the public eye. His given role was to hold everything together in the Russian capital. The Tsar would need careful handling, and Foreign Minister Savanov's resolve had caused concern from time to time. President Poincaré, Prime Minister Vivani, and senior French diplomats were expected in St. Petersburg on a mission that Izvolsky had helped organize some 6 months previously, though no fixed date had been agreed until after Sarajevo. On the 20th of July, they assembled for one purpose: to ensure Russia triggered a war with Germany. To ensure that Russia triggered a war with Germany. If Izvolsky failed to put steel into the Russian backbone and there was no war, the dream of Constantinople and the Straits might forever be gone. Izvolsky disappeared for 3 crucial weeks before the St. Petersburg meeting. There is no known record of his whereabouts. This vital gap in our knowledge of Izvolsky's whereabouts is not due to chance. No record remains of his diplomatic activities from the beginning of July 1914, and this from an agent who sent prolific notes and information to his French and Russian contacts on a daily basis. Who would have sought to blank out his contribution to the slide of perdition? Perdition. Who would have sought to blank out his contribution to the slide to perdition? Since the French leaders Poincaré and Vivani were scheduled to visit St. Petersburg, and he had to camp there to be with Sazonov and the Tsar, Izvolsky would certainly have been in communication with them prior to the visit. He would likewise have kept in regular contact with Sir Edward Grey, either through Buchanan, the British ambassador in St. Petersburg, or one of his foreign office acolytes. Sadly, we can but speculate. Izvolsky's biographer hints that his diplomatic telegrams from that time were deliberately destroyed. Whatever and wherever, we can be sure that Izvolsky was actively influencing the Franco-Russian resolve to provoke a war with Germany, backed as ever by the secret elite. One other burning question remained unanswered. What precisely would Austria do? Serbia could not go unpunished. A sense of justified indignation consumed the Austrian people. Sarajevo was the latest in a series of insults and challenges that threatened the very prestige of a nation that called itself a great power. Nor did the assassination stop the onslaught from Belgrade. Sir Maurice de Bunsen, the British ambassador in Vienna, telegraphed London to say that Serbian newspapers were behaving shamefully and virtually elevating the assassins to martyrs. When the Serbian press referred to Austria-Hungary as worm-eaten Comrade von Hotzendorf, Austrian chief of staff and head of the militarist party in Vienna, bristled at the inaction of his government. He believed that by its constant yielding to Serbian provocation, Austria had given the impression that she was impotent, and this in turn encouraged Serbia to be even more aggressive, to be ever more aggressive. Von Hotzendorf was convinced that Austria had to choose between being slowly strangled by its noxious neighbors or making a final effort to prevent its own destruction. Severe military measures had to be taken against Serbia in an act of self preservation. This was exactly the response the secret elite hoped they would get from the Austrians. Their challenge now was to encourage the key decision makers in Austria Hungary to overreact without realizing they were being led into a greater confrontation. Within a few days, the telegraph wires were hot with diplomatic intrigue. Even prior to the Archduke's inauspicious funeral, the Belgian ambassador to Berlin was able to tell Brussels that the Austrian government would demand that Serbia set up an inquiry into the assassination and permit Austro Hungarian police officers to take part in it. The ambassador added, the Pashik, the Pasik government, having deliberately shut its eyes to the hotbed of anarchist propaganda in Belgrade, ought not to be surprised at being required to take energetic measures against the guilty persons, instead of continuing to treat them with blind tolerance. Before the Archduke had been laid to rest, diplomats were clearly well informed about Austrian intentions. This information was also known to the respective foreign offices in London, Paris, and St. Petersburg. Despite their professed surprise and exaggerated pretense of shock, the key agents of the secret elite knew by the second day of July that the Austrians would demand a full investigation. Critically, at that early juncture, the Belgian ambassador clearly identified the nub of the question. Will Serbia consent to tolerate the assistance of Austro Hungarian police agents? If she refuses on the grounds that it will be an infringement on her sovereign rights, will such a dispute break out into open hostilities? It certainly would. Crucial information was to hand and positions were or was to hand. Crucial information was to hand and positions were already being taken in those early days of July. The secret elite knew that the instrument with which they could deliberately fan the flames was the question of Serbia's sovereign rights. Serbia continued to goad Austria and made little pretense of being contrite. Why? Why did the Serbs continue to aggravate the situation unless of course they and others were determined to provoke a reaction? The Times correspondent reported on the 1st of July that newspapers in Belgrade were claiming that the assassination was a consequence of the bad old Austrian police system and a lack of real liberty in Austria. The Russian press was equally aggressive. They placed the responsibility for Serb agitation on those who, like Franz Ferdinand, sowed discord between Roman Catholic Croats and Orthodox Serbs. The Viremia, the Novo, the Novo Remia published a long indictment of anti-Slav policy, which alleged that the Archduke was its leading propagandist. If the powers that controlled Serbia, both internally and from St. Petersburg, had wanted to caution restraint, then this provocation would never have been tolerated. But the assassination had not been meticulously planned as some singular act of defiance. The flames could not be doused. The Westminster Gazette, owned by Waldorf Astor from the secret elite's inner circle, stated that Austria cannot be expected to remain inactive. The Manchester Guardian, always influential in liberal circles, declared that Serbia's record was unmatched as a tissue of cruelty, greed, hypocrisy, and ill faith. If it were physically possible for Serbia to be towed be towed out to sea and sunk there, the air of Europe would at once seem clearer. It could hardly have made its position more obvious, with one exception. The Times, all English newspapers recognized that Austria had suffered intense provocation and acknowledged her right to take the strongest measures to secure the punishment of those concerned. The weekly paper, John Bull, which had a wide readership among the working class, was equally adamant that Austria's position was just. Small wonder, then, that Berchtold believed that he had the backing of the British government. Editors and direct access Editors with direct access to key members of the cabinet offered him sympathetic support for direct action. The British public were consumed by their own immediate crisis, though it was not absolutely true to say that they had their heads turned exclusively elsewhere. The overwhelming newspaper interest centered on Ulster, parliamentary uproar over Irish Home Rule, gun running, and the Ulster Volunteers. All these threatened a civil war in a very real sense. Day by day, week by week, the Loyalists in Ulster and the Home Rulers in the southern counties captured the headlines and raised the horrendous specter of a civil war that would spill over onto mainland Britain. How convenient then that for most of the month of July, home affairs dominated learned debate, while Sir Edward Grey and the Foreign Office went about their business in almost monastic silence, unburdened by the need to keep the cabinet informed of the developing crisis in Europe. Austria was determined to deal with Serbia as an act of self-preservation, but it would have been impractical to attempt this without the approval of her great ally, Germany. A letter from Emperor Franz Joseph was delivered to the Kaiser at Potsdam on the 5th of July, underlining Austria's desire to take definitive action. After discussing the representations from Vienna with his advisors, Kaiser Wilhelm gave his unqualified approval, the so-called German blank check. This was later misrepresented as a blinding promise to give Austria military support against Serbia with the deliberate intention of bringing about a European-wide war. It was nothing of the sort. Certainly, the Kaiser encouraged Austria to take whatever action she believed necessary to put Serbia in its place, but few in Germany believed that Russian military intervention in a localized dispute was a realistic possibility. Russia had no defense treaty with Serbia, and Austria had no intentions whatsoever of using force against Russia. It was inconceivable to the Kaiser that the Tsar would actively support the regicides in Serbia. One of the most deliberate historical misrepresentations of the 20th century took root in that Potsdam meeting. A great lie was concocted by the secret elite that, before going on holiday, the Kaiser convened the Crown Council meeting at Potsdam on the 5th of July and revealed his determination to make war on an unsuspecting Europe. The myth holds that he was advised to wait a fortnight in order to give German bankers time to sell off their foreign securities. Such blatant fabrication has since been unmasked as part of the orchestrated propaganda constructed to prove that Germany intimidated Austria into attacking Serbia in order to draw Russia into the conflict. In the years immediately after the war, the deliberate lie that the Kaiser was the instigator of war passed into accepted history as truth. Children learn in school, and students repeat in examinations, that war was the Kaiser's doing. In fact, the only signal he transmitted back to Vienna was that whatever Austria decided, Germany would stand by her as an ally and friend. His near desperate efforts to claw Berchtold back from the precipice at the end of the month demonstrated the sincerity of his attempts to maintain the peace of Europe. If the Kaiser is to be held at fault at all, It might not be for restraining Berchtold earlier. The difference between Sir Edward Grey and the Kaiser was that only one of them was plotting war. From Vienna, the British ambassador Sir Maurice de Bunsen advised the Foreign Office that the situation was dangerous and might rapidly deteriorate. Other diplomats conveyed the same burning sense of urgency to their respective governments, but Grey, Poincaré, and Sazonov did nothing to reduce the tension. The secret elite agenda required them to play a deadly game of charades that left Berchtold convinced Europe understood his dilemma. Austria-Hungary had to stop the Serbian-inspired rot. Grey played his cards perfectly. He may never have read Sun Tzu's Art of War, but the first rule of all war is deception. And deception was an art at which Sir Edward Grey and his Foreign Office associates were absolute masters. Reassured by support from across Europe, Berchtold came to the logical conclusion that he was expected to punish Serbia for the crime of Sarajevo. Other governments, even the Entente governments, appeared to approve the need for retribution. Indeed, the Austro-Hungarian Ministerial Council was concerned that if they did not take strong actions, their own Slav and Romanian subjects would interpret it as weakness. They agreed to make stringent demands on Serbia. Nothing else would stop their vicious intrigues. The die was cast, but few in Britain knew that the dice were even rolling. A number of interlocking steps were being taken secretly in Britain so that war would not catch the nation unprepared. An apparently unrelated debate took place in the House of Commons on the 7th of July that was fundamentally engineered to strengthen both naval supplies and the British control of the route to India before anyone embarked on war. Winston Churchill, backed strongly by his ministerial colleague Sir Edward Grey, steered the government's Anglo-Persian Oil Company bill through Parliament, oblivious to the loud objections from liberal free traders and conservative and unionist opposition. They objected vigorously to the £2 million buyout of the recently created oil company based in distant Persia. But the oil-rich sands were economically important and strategically significant. Churchill's navy was rapidly being converted from coal to oil power, and he, together with the Relugas gang, knew that it would very soon sail to war. Questions were raised about the wisdom and commercial efficacy of the Persian oil purchase. Other British oil suppliers were seriously upset, but the timing was perfect. It was a calculated move. Oil supplies were guaranteed for the Navy, the Empire made more secure. All the while, parliamentarians thought that they were debating issues of funding and the ethics of government ownerships of private companies. The plot was far thicker than that. Churchill and Grey pulled off a magnificent strategic coup just weeks before the declaration of war. A secure supply of oil was but one of a very specific numbers of conditions that had to be simultaneously contrived before the secret elite could start their war. Each in its own way was part of a grand deception. Relations with Germany in 1914 appeared to be on a surer, more positive footing than for each of the last 3 years. The crisis of Morocco and the Balkans appeared to have receded. That was an integral part of the deceit. They ensured that the public and the press were kept at arm's length from informed discussions about Europe in the weeks prior to the 4th of August. Whatever else, in any public forum, and in Parliament in particular, the chance of Britain being involved in a European war was downplayed. The deception went deeper. Members of the cabinet were denied crucial information that was circulating inside the deepest recesses of the Foreign Office. Only the secret elite's agents were trusted. Parliamentary debates had to be focused away from the Austro-Serbian dispute, and in particular, they had to avoid mention of British involvement with Russia. Had any person of note stood upon a public platform and announced that within weeks the British Expeditionary Force would be on its way to war in support of miserable Serbia and its despised Tsar, they would have been laughed from the stage, mocked and ridiculed. Such circumstances were not just beyond reason, they were beyond folly. That could never happen without the cleverest of deceptions, the most careful manipulation of headstrong men, and the complete misrepresentation of Germany's intentions. From the outset, Sir Edward Grey worked constantly to deceive the Kaiser and his advisors. On the 9th of July, the German ambassador in London, Prince Lichnowsky, was repeatedly assured by Grey that Britain had entered into no secret obligations that would come into play in the event of the European War. Lichnowsky confidently assured his government that English wished to preserve an absolutely free hand to act accordingly to her own judgment in the event of continental complications. He also reported that Grey said he would be willing to persuade the Russian government to adopt a more peaceful and conciliatory attitude towards Austria. Pure deception. Grey had been intimately associated with the commitments made through the Committee of Imperial Defense since 1905. His commitment to the secret elite's cause overrode honesty. He did nothing to reconcile Russia and Austria. In fact, his ambassador in St. Petersburg, Sir George Buchanan, was there to steady Sazonov's shaky hand in the desperate drive to war. You might have expected the Foreign Affairs debate in the House of Commons on the 10th of July to have discussed the growing tensions in the Balkans or the Austrian response to Sarajevo. What about British concerns over Serbia or the rumors circulating in newspapers and diplomatic circles all over Europe that Austria was planning to punish Serbia severely? What would Russia do? Might relationships between the great powers turn dangerously sour? It was an opportunity for a serious debate that would have warned the nation of ominous developments that would well lead to a continental war. If the Foreign Office had honorably tried to raise the level of public awareness, then this was the logical platform. But these questions were never raised. The very last outcome the secret elite wanted was to allow time and opportunity for a powerful anti-war lobby to be established. The debate was a masterclass in deception. Members of Parliament had their democratic say about commercial interests and allegations of other nations acting unfairly against British companies and investors. It set a tone of self-interest that was occasionally broken by a shard of enlightenment. Honorable members discussed China, India, Persia, and Russia, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank improving relations with Germany, Portugal, and Turkish Armenia, but not the crisis in the Balkans. Sir Edward Grey said not a word to criticize or disagree with major points that were completely at odds with the true objectives of the Foreign Office, and then ignored them completely. Had it not been so serious, so calamitous, so despicable, the reader might find it amusing to appreciate how successfully he used the House of Commons to lull the country at large, and the Germans in particular, into believing that Britain had not the slightest concern that the events in Sarajevo might lead to a continental war.